Hello, you are on the live webinar of Learn Liberty. Again, today is the second episode of Life with Liberty course. Uh, Welcome, Craig. Welcome back.
Thanks, Nasli. Good to be here again.
How are you doing? How is it today?
I'm doing great. I'm doing great. Yesterday, about an hour after our first session ended, I had gotten my second Moderna shot the day before. And my first Moderna shot, I didn't even feel a thing at all. But yesterday, about an hour after we finished this thing, I got the chills, came on just out of the blue. I was freezing cold and my body was shaking. And this went on for about 20 minutes. I jumped in a hot shower and felt better, but it was weird because I had no anticipation that I would have any problems like that. But I once again want to bow to the geeks out there who I call the gods. I always say there is a God and he's the geeks. He's the people who can produce these things, this vaccination. I might have gotten a little chill from it, but I'm also now, protected from a genuinely, a horrible disease. So I guess just give a shout out yesterday after that episode to you scientists and tech-minded people who make that stuff happen. You guys are the best.
Yeah, I mean, it's big, and it's also very good that you actually had the chance to get that. In my country, I live in Turkey still. It's going very, very slow, especially for young people. So I'm glad you could do that. And it's cool. I mean, I was thinking the same. It's just I don't know, maybe a week of not feeling great, but it's definitely going to save a lot of lives on the other hand. So shout out to vaccine people from me too.
Yes, yes. Shout out to them and a big well, for lack of a better word, finger to the statists who are blocking the way of these producers and distributors who could be getting this all over the world now with relative ease if the statists would get the heck out of the way and let that happen. So we'll give justice in both directions. Thank you to the scientists and the producers of this thing. And please get out of the way, you rotten statists.
Yeah, that's a great introduction. So let me introduce you once again. I'm pretty sure some of our viewers are familiar with you after the first episode of this webinar, this course. But Craig is the co-founder and director of education at Objective Standard Institute, and editor of the Objective Standard also. And he is the executive director of Prometheus Foundation. He's the author of many, many books. I figured out yesterday. Some of them are Rational Egoism, The Morality of Human Flourishing, Moral Truths to Your Parents, and he is working on his next book, Thinking in Principles. So give another quick outline again. This is the second of our series. Today we're going to discuss reason, purpose, and self-esteem. Yesterday we discussed the basics of Ayn Rand's philosophy and the morality of life. And we're going to follow from that discussion. So if you want to watch what happened yesterday, you can also see it on our website, the channel. And I'm leaving the floor to Craig.
Thank you, Nesla. Appreciate that. And welcome back, lovers of liberty and life and happiness from all over the planet. I think I got those words backwards. Life, liberty, and happiness. Let's go with that. That's the title of this seminar. That's the overarching title, is Ayn Rand's Philosophy for Life, Liberty, and Happiness. And I think in the first episode yesterday, we got to see a bit of a peek of why I call it that, her philosophy of life, liberty, and happiness. We certainly have seen that it's very much about life. We're going to get to liberty, and we've seen a lot about happiness so far. But I love that title because it's very descriptive. Philosophy for these three things. And we'll continue today to see why that is so. I want to begin just with a very quick recap. I mean, people can go watch yesterday's video, the first session. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on that, but I want to recap a little bit and set the stage for today's discussion. So yesterday we began basically by talking about what philosophy is and why we need this thing. And we discovered that we have a philosophy, whether we're consciously aware of it or not. We get this either through social osmosis by just sort of uncritically accepting the ideas of the culture we're raised in, or the parents, preachers, or teachers that tell us things or whatever, or we can think ourselves independently and consciously and deliberately about whether a given philosophy or a particular philosophic idea makes sense, whether we can see with our own independent reasoning that this idea is supported by evidence and therefore true. So that's what we want to do. Again, we want to get back to this MO of being very oriented around, does this thing make sense or not? Also yesterday, we looked at the beginning of the presentation about Rand's ideas. And we looked first at the centerpiece of her philosophy, the morality of life, which she also calls rational egoism. And we basically went through the derivation of life, human life, as the standard of moral value. This is the idea that the standard by which we can judge good and bad, right and wrong, how we should and shouldn't act, is the requirements of the life of the kind of animal we are. We're a rational animal who survives by means of using his reasoning mind and understanding reality by means of that, and figuring out what things are and how we can combine them to make the values that are necessary for us to sustain and further our lives. And we talked a lot about the fact that Rand's whole philosophy, not only her morality, but the whole thing, is really just all about living. It's all about what can we do to ensure that we understand reality so we can apply that knowledge to the process of living wonderful lives. So you can think about this way. Objectivism is the philosophy of value pursuits. It's the philosophy for living, right? That's a positive way of stating it. But if we put the same idea in negative form, I would put it this way. Objectivism is a philosophy of non-sacrifice, a philosophy of non-sacrifice. It's against the idea of giving up more important values for the sake of lesser values. It's against the idea of you sacrificing yourself for other people, or you sacrificing other people for yourself, right? It's against altruism, the traditional moral codes that we talked about yesterday, which hold that being moral consists in self-sacrificially serving other people or selflessly, committing acts of selflessness. And it's also against predation. Objectivism is against predation. The idea that, well, I can do anything I want because I'm stronger than you. The idea that might makes right, or that there is no such thing as a principle. There are principles, and we can derive them from reality, as we did yesterday, some principles, by asking questions about the nature of things, and by looking at examples and being empirical and being scientific, in effect, about this stuff. So we're going to continue this today. And I want to make a big exclamation point on this business of pursuing values as the goal, pursuing our life-serving values, the values that will sustain us existentially and enable us psychologically to love our lives and be fueled to do more value pursuits, so that we can continue this wonderful process of living as human beings. And the negative side of that, which is don't sacrifice yourself, don't sacrifice other people. We don't need human life. Here's a good way to think about this. Human life does not require human sacrifice. I love that formulation, because it really gets to the core. It's like, well, of course, human life doesn't require human sacrifice. If I were to say, look, here's a baby, like the Incas and Mayas used to cut the hearts out of babies to appease the gods, right? Here's a baby, and I'm going to kill this baby to do what? To appease the god? There are no gods up there that they were appeasing. There was just a baby that was alive, and they killed the thing. That's not a value pursuit. It's a sacrifice of a living human being, and it's immoral. It's just factually immoral. And every other form of human sacrifice is also factually immoral. It's immoral because it's against the requirements of human life, right? Now, this is Rand's view. Again, I want to emphasize here, I'm not trying to advocate Rand's view. Obviously, I agree with it, so there's some advocacy in my voice. But I want you to understand what her view is, so that you can make your own decision about whether you think her philosophy makes sense and is worth using in your life. But this is her view, that human sacrifice as such, is morally wrong in all of its instances, because it's against human life, which is the standard of moral value. So you could put it this way too: to flourish, we must choose and develop a value hierarchy. Remember, we talked yesterday about getting your values in order. What's more important to my life and what's less important and what's really trivial and what doesn't matter at all. And to me, I don't like to watch ball sports like football and basketball and stuff like that. That has no value to me in my life whatsoever. So they're not in my value hierarchy. The things that are in my value hierarchy are, my career, my work, my wife, my romantic relationship, my daughter, whom I adore and have a great relationship with, and then some hobbies that I do. My wife and I like to ballroom dance, and I like to do some other sports like skiing and rock climbing, although a recent car accident has eliminated those from my life temporarily, possibly permanently. But the point is, I love to listen to music. I love to watch movies. These things matter to me. And they matter in different degrees. Whether I can watch the next episode of Ted Lasso, which is a great show, by the way. You got to check that out if you haven't seen it. Absolutely wonderful television show.
It really is. I was watching it too with my boyfriend.
I'm glad you're watching. I just adore the show, and I adore Ted Lasso and the coach. His assistant coach is hysterical too, and the Indian assistant too. The whole thing is just wonderful. Anyway,
that's amazing.
Don't get me started on Ted Lasso, or we won't get anything more done about this. But my point is that, watching the next episode of Ted Lasso is important to me, but it's not as important as my career, right? And if something involving advancing my career, I really needed to get done today, I would not watch Ted Lasso tonight, right? I would do the thing that's more important. But you can't make these kinds of decisions about what you're going to do based on your value hierarchy unless you've developed that value hierarchy, unless you know what that thing is. If your values are all just dispersed and you've never thought about what things are more important or less important or really essential or non-essential, then you really can't think that way. And Rand talks about this at one point in one of her books. She says, the way that we spend our time in life is, and should be, looked at akin to the way that we spend money in life. Your time is limited. You only have a certain amount of time in your life. And every moment, every hour or minute that you spend doing something that doesn't advance your life in some way, whether being productive or having recreation or taking a rest. I mean, all of those things can be life enhancing and advancing. But if you're not doing something that's advantageous to the advancement of your life, then you're actually doing something that's harmful to your life. Because even if there's really no such thing as like a neutral action, either you're acting in a way that's good for your life, or whatever action you're taking isn't good for your life, in which case there's no point in doing it, right? And so she advocates getting this value hierarchy in order and then choosing to act consistently on that value hierarchy as a matter of principle in your life. Getting your value hierarchy in order and then choosing as a matter of principle to act in accordance with that value hierarchy throughout your life, literally as a principle. So this is where then moral principles come from, fact-based moral principles. What's the fact that they're based in? The idea that the reason we need values is because we're alive and we want to stay alive and flourish. That's the base, right? This life as the standard of value. And then the big question is, how do we do that? Well, we do it by being consistent to our value hierarchy and taking certain actions that advance our life accordingly. And we'll talk more about that next. Nasli, you had your hand up.
Yeah, so I wanted to clarify when we talk about this value hierarchy, is there an objective set of values that are already put in a list for us as in a hierarchy, or are we choosing ourselves what's for our own hierarchy in these values?
Excellent question, and the answer is both. And but the first part, it's not that there's some value hierarchy that you don't choose, but that's just there, and then you choose these other ones. You actually choose both sides, but one side, one set, and we'll be talking about those today. They include reason, purpose, and self-esteem, which is the title of today's talk, right? One set of values is universal in the sense that everyone needs these things in order to live as a human being, right? We all need those things, and we'll see why shortly. But we don't all need to watch Ted Lasso or watch football games, right? You see the difference there. So some values, and indeed many values, most values, are optional in that sense. They're optional in the sense that they are life-serving, but they're life-serving given a particular individual's set of values, which themselves are life-serving because they're based on the same fundamentals that yours and mine are. So there's a universal set of values that you still have to choose. You can choose not to live. If you don't want to live, you can choose not to live, right? So you still have to choose these. You've got to choose to live. You've got to choose to use reason. If you're going to use it, it doesn't happen automatically. So the choice is still there. The difference is not so much that one set is chosen and the other set's not. The difference is that one set is universal and the other set is your personal selection of optional values within a big range. It's a great question. Okay, so then the big question now that we're going to move on to the next section is how can we do this? So the goal now, we've got this goal in mind. We want to live a long life, hopefully many decades, and we want to fill it with all the joy and meaning and wonderful times that we can, doing things we love to do, hanging out with people we love to hang out with, being productive, engaging in art and recreation, the whole 9 yards. Like, we're really complex beings, and that's what we're trying to do, is live this big, wonderful life. So how do we do it? Well, we do it by using the same tool that we've been using all along in this course to understand any of this to begin with, right? Our reasoning minds. Reason is the faculty that enables us to understand the world. We've got to use it by choice if we're going to use it. It doesn't happen automatically. You don't just wake up and your reasoning mind starts figuring out what's true. If you want to figure out, because you can wake up and just go with the herd. You guys probably know, unfortunately, too many people who do that, right? They just they put, lick their finger, put it up, see which way the wind's blowing with their tribe or the group, and they go that way. Oh, okay, I'll do that, right? So you can be, by choice, sort of an automaton and just go with the crowd. Or you can say, no, I'm going to activate my mind as a regular thing, and I'm going to figure out what I think is true. I'm going to choose my own values, and I'm going to pursue those things, and I'm going to hang out with people I like, and I'm going to stay away from the people that I think are rotten, and so on. That's a rational approach. And so we're going to now start talking about the use of this faculty, reason, for this big goal. And while we're talking about reason, I want to talk simultaneously, if you will, about the other mental faculty that's right there in everyone's mind, no doubt here, which is emotion. Right? Emotion, we have two mental faculties as human beings. We have reason, which operates by means of volition, and we've talked about that. And then we have this emotional faculty, which is also extremely important. It's vital to a life of happiness. If you didn't have an emotional faculty, what would happiness even mean? It wouldn't be a thing. There would be, happiness is a state of consciousness. It's an emotional reaction to things. So these are both really important. And what I want to do today is get super clear on the difference between these two and how they work together as a life-serving, harmonious team. So what is reason? What is this thing we use? I mean, we use it, so we have it, and we know something about how it works, but what exactly is this? Well, Rand identified reason, or defined reason, as the faculty that identifies and integrates the material provided by man's senses. So by our senses, we look out at the world, we see things like, cats and birds and dogs, right? And then we integrate those perceptions into concepts in our mind that stand for those things: cat, bird, dog. And then we can integrate those animals together into a broader, more abstract concept: animal or mammal, right? Something like that. So you see how what she means by the faculty that identifies and then integrates the material provided by our senses. This is how reason works. And we not only integrate these ideas into concepts, we also integrate them into propositions. The cat is on the mat. Generalizations. If we want to live a good life, then we have to figure out how to do that, right? There's a generalization for you. And another one, if we want to live in a free society, then we have to figure out what the conditions are that are necessary to have that thing, right? And this is what our reasoning faculty does. It's the faculty by which people discovered the principles of physics, the principles of engineering. It's the reason that bridges hold your car when you drive over them, right? Somebody used reason to make that happen. So reason is our basic means of living because it's our only means of knowledge, is Rand's key point here. And so it's our basic life-serving value. There's nothing more important to advancing our life than understanding reality and the requirements of our life. Now, emotions, what are these? Well, emotions are basically automatic reactions to your experiences or thoughts in relation to your preconceived values. So I'll give an example that makes it really clear. If you love a particular football team and there's a big game tomorrow, and then you tune in and you watch the game, and maybe you bet some money on this game or whatever, and if your team wins, you feel joy, right? You feel an emotion of joy. Why? What happened there? Well, you had a value in your mind already. You think you love this team. They're your favorite, right? There's the value judgments. And then something happened, an event happened that impinged on those values very positively because you won, and the emotion arises automatically. It's not, emotions aren't chosen, they happen automatically as based on our values and the things that we encounter in relation to those values, right? So we can multiply examples like this, but you get the idea. If your favorite team loses, then you feel, oh, bummer. You have a negative emotion for the same reason going in the other direction. So just with that simple example, you can extrapolate. You know, if you're asking someone out, a guy's asking out a girl, and she says yes, right? The value is, I'd love to have a date with this girl. She says yes. The event happens. He feels great. This is wonderful, right? So that's what emotions are. And you can think of emotions this way. They are our psychological means of experiencing our values. There are psychological, internal means of experiencing our values. So if I start a company and things are going well, and I look back at the past year and I'm like, man, this rocked, everything was going great, right? This is much more substantial than just my team won, right? This is a big value, a big emotion on the basis of something really substantial that I've done. And these kinds of emotions over time add up. Right now, we have plenty of downs in life. No, Rand is not saying that you don't have bad times and negative emotions, but the goal in life is to live in a successful way so that we have as many positive, life-serving, happiness-oriented emotions as possible. And this is what gives rise to a sort of a steady state of happiness that you can acquire in life, and that some people do, and it's a great place to be, right? To have a steady state of happiness where you're so delighted with the way that your life is going that even when bad things happen, that just doesn't, the pain doesn't go down, but so far. It doesn't have a massive effect. Now, if your lover dies of cancer, then, that you can be really down for a while. But if the rest of your life is going well, even when something like that happens, you can at least recover from that to some extent. Whereas if your whole life was rotten and that happened, then, everything would bottom out. So you see the importance of emotions. Is a non-trivial thing, and nothing in Ayn Rand's philosophy is at all disparaging toward emotions. She said, in fact, I like to put it this way. Objectivism is both 100% pro reason, says you should use reason all the time for what it is, your means of knowledge. And it's also 100% pro emotion. You should always let your emotions be what they are so that you can experience your values, whether positive or negative, hopefully mostly positive. Why? Because that's where you get the values in life. Your values are experienced through your emotional faculty. So, whereas Rand makes a very big deal of reason because it's our means of knowledge and because it's our basic means of living, figuring out what to do to live, she makes a big deal of that, but there is no disparagement in her work whatsoever. In fact, her work is just laced with emotional charge. And so it's a good way to think of it, that this philosophy is both pro-reason and pro-emotion, and 100% in both cases. Now, so reason as against what? Like, what are the alternatives? What is something? Well, okay, well, doesn't everyone go by reason? Well, unfortunately, no. A lot of people really don't. I think people, in order to just live, you've got to use reason to some extent. I mean, you've got to stop at traffic lights or you're just going to get run over by a car, right? So nobody who remains alive for long literally doesn't use reason at all. But people mix that sort of fundamental, occasional use of reason with other things sometimes. And one thing that people mix it with is emotionalism. Now, I've just made a big deal about emotions being really important. So what is emotionalism? Well, it's treating emotions as something that they're not. It's abusing your emotional faculty or misusing your emotional faculty. Emotionalism is treating your emotional faculty as if it were your means of knowledge, as if it could tell you what's true and false out in the world or the way that you should act. This you don't want to do. You don't want to treat your emotional faculty, which is a very important specific thing, your psychological means of enjoying your values and experiencing your values. You don't want to treat that as if it were reason. There's a reason we have two different terms here, emotion and reason. They're different things. And emotionalism is the treatment of emotions as if they were something other than your means of psychologically experiencing your values. So Rand is against that. She says, this is not good for you. Don't do it. Bad for your life, right? Another form of non-reason is faith. Faith is the acceptance of ideas in the absence of any evidence to support those ideas, or acceptance of ideas that are actually contradicted by evidence. It can be even more dramatic, right? So if you say, if you have a friend who has consistently been dishonest and you've watched this dishonesty over several months, and you kid yourself and say, oh, I have faith that he's a good person anyway. Well, you're abandoning the evidence that you have that this person has given you, and you're replacing that actual evidence, what your rational faculty would tell you is true, with faith. Just, I'm going to accept this in the absence of evidence or in defiance of the evidence. Okay, so that's an instance of faith. Another instance of faith, of course, is the religious versions, where people just accept ideas. The idea, for instance, that's now, again, I'm talking to you about Rand's philosophy. She is an atheist, and you don't have to agree with her ideas. I'm sure there are plenty of religious people listening. But here's Rand's thinking on faith, and I think it's worth thinking through, because you should make your own decisions about whether faith makes sense. You shouldn't just accept it because your parents told you that it's good, and you shouldn't accept it because a preacher told you it's good. You should say, what makes sense to me? Well, here's the way that Rand thinks you ought to think about what faith is. It's acceptance of ideas on the basis of no evidence whatsoever. So somebody tells you there's a guy in a supernatural dimension who came up with 10 commandments, and you have to follow these, etc. And the only way to accept these ideas as true is to accept them on faith. There's no evidence to support them, which is why no one has ever provided evidence to support these kinds of ideas. There's just, I accept them. Well, if you think about it, this is just another form of emotionalism. It's just going, I want to accept this, so I'm going to accept it, regardless of the fact that there's no evidence or rational grounds to accept this. And Rand thinks this is really destructive to either treat your emotions as a means of knowledge, or to treat faith as a means of knowledge. I mean, if you think about faith as a means of knowledge, if faith truly were a means of knowledge, then anything that someone just had faith was true would by that fact be true. If it's a means of knowledge, it's a means of knowledge, right? So the hijackers, the jihadists who flew airplanes into the skyscrapers in New York City back in 2021 or 2001, they had faith that they should do that. How could you, if faith is a means of knowledge, how could they be wrong about that? They can't. It was true that they should do that. That's what it means for faith to be a means of knowledge. It's a really dangerous idea. And we have a very good understanding of how reason works, right? We know that we perceive reality with our five senses. We integrate these into concepts and things the way I was talking about a few minutes ago. How does faith work? What are the mechanisms or the apparatuses by which faith works? There aren't any. because it's not a faculty of knowledge. It's just the acceptance of ideas without any basis. So Rand says of these things, don't do that, go by reason. Doesn't mean ignore your emotions. It means use your emotions for what they are, and then use reason for what it is. And the last thing I'll say on this is that Rand integrated all of the non-rational approaches. So emotionalism, faith, revelation, ESP, extrasensory perception, tarot card readings, all of that. She puts that all into one big package, and she calls it mysticism. Which she defines as any claim to a non-rational means of knowledge. Yeah, I get my knowledge from tarot cards, or yeah, I get my knowledge from reading crystals, or I get my knowledge from the Bible, or I get it from my buddy who I accept his word no matter what he says, right? That's all not using reason. And she says, don't do that, go by reason. Now, why go by reason? Why not let your mind wander into these other areas? Because in order to live, this goes back to the whole theme of this seminar. The whole purpose here is to live a wonderful life here in this wonderful world that we live in, or this hugely potentially wonderful world. I mean, there are lots of problems in this world, but this is the one reality we know exists. It's the one life that we know we have, and there's no evidence for any others. So just use your reasoning mind to live beautifully in this world. And that's what she advocates on this count. All right. Now we're going to go and talk about purpose next, but let's see if there are any questions about reason before we move on to purpose.
I think it will tie better with the whole idea, so we can continue with the purpose. And then I think we're going to have many more questions when we come to virtues and the values, how they merge together.
Perfect. Yeah, and I think that probably will be where more of the questions.
It will solve more questions.
Yeah. Okay, so Ayn Rand held that there are basically three what she called cardinal values. These are the values that she said are essential to everyone's life. If you're a human being, you need these things. So Natalie, this goes to your point, your question about, what's the difference between chosen values and maybe sort of universal values. These are three universal values: reason, purpose, and self-esteem. We'll talk about each of them in connection. And we've talked a lot about reason, so we're not going to do a whole lot more on that. But I want to show how purpose and self-esteem integrate with reason to form this really amazing triptych of important values. An interesting thing to note just at the start of these is observe that all three of these values, reason, purpose, and self-esteem, are spiritual values. These are not material values. This isn't a car or money or a summer home, right? These are spiritual values. And Rand is sometimes criticized as being a materialist of some sort, both in philosophical terms, a materialist, like there's only matter, which she disagrees with, and also in just a lifestyle approach. Well, she's just after material. That's ridiculous. Her three fundamental values are all spiritual values. And let's see what the importance of these is. So a purpose is a goal of some kind. It's specifically a conscious, intentional goal, something that you pursue for a desired outcome. Your career is a really good example of this. I don't think there's a better example than that, right? So you say, I want to be a doctor, or I want to be a musician, or I want to be, a gardener, whatever it is. I mean, you can choose that. And so that's a long-term goal. It's a goal that involves a whole process, a whole series of steps, and it's an ongoing thing. And another purpose would be, I want to have a wonderful relationship with this person I love. So this is a long-term aim that's very complex. You have to do a lot of things to make a long-term relationship work. And those are examples of purposes. So purpose is a conscious, intentional goal, a goal that you pursue for a desired outcome. What's the outcome you're looking for in a romantic relationship? All of the joy that you get out of romance. What's the outcome you're looking for in your career? All of the joy and fulfillment and meaning that you get out of that kind of a career. And so, it's clear, just if you introspect and look out at your life, this is really important stuff. This is the stuff of which a wonderful life is made. And that's why Rand regards purpose as so important. You really do need these things. If you don't choose any purposes in life, if you don't have any big goals that you're after, your life is just totally mitigated. I mean, it's just like shortcut into sort of a non-human type of living. You're just like, you're closer to a vegetable than you are to a human being if you're not pursuing things, right? So purpose is super important. Now observe that your purposes as these spiritual values, things you want, this is very close to emotions, isn't it? It's a purpose is kind of there's an emotional element in purposes. Now it's not strictly an emotion because it's a consciously thought out goal. So the reason goes into a purpose as long as it's a rational purpose. I mean, a bank robber can have a purpose too, but it's not a rational purpose. So if your purpose is your long-term goals, your purpose, your goals that you're pursuing for this big desired outcome, if those are rational, there's definitely an emotional element to these things. So you can see the integration right there of reason and emotion. Another thing to note about the relationship of reason and purpose is that it's essentially a means-end relationship. Your purposes are goals. They're ends that you're after, things you're trying to achieve. Reason is your means of doing two things. A, choosing purposes that are actually in your self-interest, because if you don't use reason and you choose purposes out of focus, you might choose purposes that are actually bad for your life, right? Shooting heroin or robbing banks or whatever. I mean, these things aren't not good for you factually. So, use reason to choose your purposes, but then reason also is the tool that helps you figure out how to achieve your purposes. Right? So you see the connection there. How do you figure out how to make a long-term romantic relationship work so that things stay fun and interesting and fresh and sex is great and you have lots of, ecstasy and all the things you want from a romantic relationship? Huge amounts of emotional charge in that, but your emotions don't tell you how to make that happen. Reason tells you how to make that. Well, I've got to treat my lover justly. If I'm horrible to my romantic partner, treat her unjustly, lie to her, cheat on her, etc., that's not going to work. Reason, my faculty of reason tells me that that's true if I activate it. Likewise for my career. If I want to succeed in my career, I have to activate my mind. So what do I need to do? What opportunities are there out there? Who might I contact to try to tap into some of these opportunities? What things can I create to make people say, hey, this guy or this gal's really a value producer. Maybe we ought to hire that person or bring him into our startup or whatever. It's your reasoning faculty that does that. So you can see how purpose and reason work together. It's a means-end relationship of sorts, although reason plays both roles, helping you choose your life-serving purposes and then helping you to achieve them. Now, what happens when you use your mind, you choose these long-term, really big, important life-serving purposes, and then you go after them and you start to have some success? What happens? What do you feel like after you have big success and big difficult things you try to achieve using your mind, and then you get some success and it works, right? You have this feeling of self-esteem arises in you, right? You start to feel good about yourself, about your ability to deal with the world, about your ability to succeed in the world, and about your worthiness of success, right? You start to feel like, yeah, I worked really hard and I deserve this success that I'm achieving because I worked really hard. And this is why Rand regards self-esteem as one of these three cardinal values, right? Self-esteem is basically the core ingredient of genuine happiness. Self-esteem is the core ingredient of genuine happiness. If you feel really good about yourself in this regard, you feel like you're capable of success in this world and you're worthy of success, and the reason that you think those two things is because you've demonstrated to yourself that you can succeed by making a real effort. And that's what happens when you use your mind and try to achieve big goals, like graduating from a school you want to graduate from, or starting a company, or getting a job, or succeeding in one of your hobbies. Maybe you love golfing and you do really well on the golf course one day, right? So any successes like this make you have this feeling of, man, I can do this thing called life. I'm good at this. You start to feel good about yourself and you start to feel worthy of the kind of success that you have. And this is why Rand said that self-esteem basically breaks down into those two parts. It's the conviction that you are capable of living, that you're efficacious in the world, and that you're worthy of success because you exert effort and really give it your best rational shot. Again, this doesn't mean that if you're rational and purposeful, that everything is going to go your way and you'll always have, oh, I win at everything. That does not happen. It just means that you'll know that you made the effort, and therefore your successes, and there will be successes, of course, your successes will give you this really important ingredient of happiness called self-esteem. So you can think of it this way. I'll put the cap on self-esteem. Self-esteem has two ingredients: self-confidence and self-respect. Self-confidence is the idea that I'm capable of dealing with the world. Self-respect is the idea that I'm a good person and I'm worthy of doing this. I don't lie, cheat, and steal. I use my brain and my reasoning mind to go after things in a rational way and really go after my values. And this is where, by the way, somebody mentioned guilt yesterday. This is where guilt would not be in your soul, because you are embracing a philosophy. If you embrace Rand's philosophy like this, you're embracing a philosophy that says you should go after your goals and be honest and be rational and all of that. So when you succeed, you're only going to feel good. You're not going to feel bad. You're not going to feel guilty. Yes.
It also sounds like we don't do things that would harm other people, not just because it wouldn't harm them, but it also wouldn't harm yourself.
Yes, really good point. When you harm other people, unless, if somebody's attacking you and you use self-defense, obviously that's a different story, and we'll talk about that tomorrow. But yeah, if you're harming other people, innocent other people, to get what you want from them or whatever, if you're being a predator of some sort, whether an emotional predator, you're trying to, use psychology against, weird psychology against somebody to get them to do things that are good for you but are bad for them or whatever. This is not good for you. When people do that, they know they're doing it on some level. They can try to pretend that they're not doing it. That's called evasion. And Ayn Rand regarded that as the core evil that somebody can do, is to evade. But people know when they're pretending and they're faking reality to try to get something. And we're going to talk about this in a minute, because it's the virtue of honesty we're talking about. It says don't do that because it's not good for you. So yeah, when you do that to other people, it is not good for you. It's not good for them, and it's not good for you. So it's not the way to work with people. So we've got these three cardinal values: reason, purpose, self-esteem. We've got this integrated being that we are. We're a being of mind and body, matter and spirit, however you want to put it. There's two parts. There's the physical and there's the mental part. We've looked at the mental elements: reason, purpose, self-esteem, emotions, all very important. So what we want to do is live a beautiful life using these tools. And this brings us to virtue, what Rand calls virtue. Now, values are what we've been talking about. Now, we've also been talking about virtue to some extent, because a virtue is an action by means of which you achieve a value. That's the way Rand defines it, essentially. A virtue is an action by means of which you achieve a life-serving value. I'll get life-serving in there because that's always got to be on the table with Rand's philosophy. Now, so we've been talking about actions. We've been talking about thinking, which is an action, and pursuing careers, which is an action, and pursuing a romantic relationship, that's an action, and doing hobbies. So it's not like we haven't been talking about virtue all along, but I want to put it explicitly on the table now to give you an indication of how Rand thinks about what a virtue is, as distinct from a value, because they're related but different. The values are the goods that we need in order to live. You need purpose. You need self-esteem. You need to use this thing called reason. You need freedom. You need a bunch of other things too, but those are some of the things you need. What do we need to do to get those? Well, we need to act in certain ways. And because reason is our basic means of understanding the world and our basic means of living, all of the virtues that Rand identifies are instances of the use of reason. And we'll see that now as we start talking about some of her virtues. Rand named 7 virtues that she regarded as the fundamental virtues, the fundamental principled actions by which you achieve life-serving values. She did not say this was an exhaustive list. There are other virtues too. I'm going to name her virtues here, but one of her virtues do not include, for instance, teamwork. But in a business setting where you've got a team that has to work together, teamwork is a virtue. If somebody's not engaging in teamwork, they're not doing the thing we're trying to do here. That's not going to work, right? So it is a virtue. I just want to be very clear that Rand's list here is not exhaustive in the sense that there aren't any other virtues. It's just that she regarded these things we're going to talk about here as really fundamental in that they're essential to all human beings, pretty much no matter the context. Now, some of them, productiveness, as we'll talk about, does have a context. You're not producing values all day, every day. Sometimes you're just enjoying values. But you get the idea. Some of these it's sort of like the difference between the universal values that we talked about and the chosen values, that these fundamental virtues are essential. Now, the first of these is rationality, unsurprisingly, right? Because of the focus on reason here as our basic means of living. And so I'm not going to say a lot about that. It's just that Rand says you have to treat your faculty of knowledge as what it is. You have to treat it as your faculty of knowledge, and don't pretend that you have some other faculty of knowledge when you don't. So it's the virtue of reason is basically the acceptance and the action on the principle that reason is your only means of knowledge, your basic means of living, and your only proper judge of values. Your only proper judge of values. This does not mean that you shouldn't let emotions come into your judgment of values. It just means that reason is your trump card. If you feel like doing something that you want to do, and then your reason mind thinking tells you, well, actually, that wouldn't be good for you long term. Reason wins that debate in a rational person's head. You don't let your emotional faculty trump your rational faculty on that. That's what it means to hold reason as an absolute in this sense. So that's what rationality is just using reason that way. Now, human life is super complex because of this complex thing that we are. We have to deal with other people, various relationships, all the internal and external things in our lives. It's just crazy how complex we are. So Rand comes up with these virtues that are instances of reason applied to very specific aspects of life, or more specific aspects. One of her virtues is the virtue of productiveness. And productiveness is the recognition of the fact that in order to live as a human being, you have to produce the values on which your life depends, right? Either you've got to produce the values for consumption, whether food, clothing, shelter, or any other values, spiritual values and like, or you've got to produce those values so that you can trade them with other people to get the things from them. Like I don't produce, iPhones and vaccines, but I can get them because I produce something that enables me to trade, right? So productiveness is a virtue in Rand's, a fundamental virtue, by virtue of the fact that it's just a fact that you have to do this in order to live, right? It's not an opinion that this is a virtue, as Rand would bring. It's a fact that you need this to live, right? So that's one of her virtues. And all of her virtues, by the way, follow this principle. There's some follow this pattern. There's some principle or fact out there that we can identify that's a truth. And then there's an action that corresponds to that truth. It's a fact that I have to be productive in order to live. Therefore, I should be productive so that I can live. That's the principle and action relationship. Honesty is another virtue that Rand holds. Now, honesty does not mean never tell a lie. That's a superficial version of what honesty is. If the Nazis come to your door looking for a Jewish person, and you're hiding a Jewish person in your attic, and they say, "Are there any Jewish people in your home?" and you say no, you are not being dishonest. You are actually being honest, and I'll explain why. I want to just start with that example because that might sound impossible. But here's the thing. Honesty is not the virtue of never telling a lie. Honesty is the virtue of never faking reality, never pretending that reality is other than it is in order to achieve a value. Now, when the Nazis come to your door looking for Jewish people, who is faking reality? You or the Nazis? Do the Nazis have a right to kill Jewish people? No. Do they have a right to be the tyrannical, horrible people that they are? No. Is it true that you know that they don't have that right, and that protecting this girl is morally correct on the basis of the principle that life is the standard of value? Yes. You're not faking anything. Your lie to the Nazis there is actually an act of honesty. It's an act of you recognizing all of the relevant facts in this picture and not evading any of them. Whereas the Nazis are acting in a way that is evading most of the relevant facts in this issue and focusing only on their irrational goal of killing somebody for having a different race. So just like there's a black and white difference here. So honesty does not mean never telling a lie. Now, lies should be, used only in instances like that, when there's a real reason you're really protecting a value against somebody who's trying to harm that value. But the virtue of honesty, to get back to the more positive presentation on this, the virtue of honesty is just a virtue of recognizing the fact that the unreal is unreal. Recognizing the fact that the unreal is unreal. We live in reality. In order to live in that place, we have to develop our mind to understand reality, and we have to get the values in reality that exist and turn them into things that we can use in our lives. And all of that requires your mind staying connected to reality. As soon as you start pretending that facts are other than they are, setting aside fiction and and art, which you do that for a specific reason. But if you're pretending that facts are other than they are in order to try to achieve some value that you actually shouldn't even be getting, that is what Rand calls dishonesty, and it's bad. It's bad for your life. Nasli, you mentioned earlier, when you abuse someone, it's not only bad for them, it's also bad for you. Exactly. Why? Because you know that you shouldn't be doing this on some level. Now, if you understand Rand's explanation of honesty, you know it at a higher level than a lot of people do. And it's good to have that knowledge at a higher level. It's like, oh, I really understand what's wrong with dishonesty. But everyone senses on some level, even kids, which is why when a kid tells a lie, he looks real sheepish about it, right? You can tell when kids lie because they look very unhappy with themselves. So we know that to be honest is good for your life. It just means it's like the flip side of rationality. Rationality says always go by reason so that you can understand this world. Honesty says, yeah, never pretend that this world is other than it is, because that would be not going by reason, and that's not good for you. Another virtue Rand speaks about as fundamental is integrity. And she has a slightly different approach to this than the traditional view of integrity is just walking your talk or, practicing what you preach. You've heard these cliches. Well, Rand would disagree with that unless what you're talking or preaching is rational. Because again, if we look at the jihadists who flew jets into American skyscrapers, they were acting in accordance with their judgment. They had bought into this idea that Allah wants them to kill infidels. And so they acted on their values. Did they have integrity? Rand would say absolutely not, because their values were so irrational as to be absurd. Integrity, in Rand's view, is adherence to rational principles. All right. So it's not just adherence to any old principles. It's choosing rational principles and rational values, ideas that actually make sense to you, given your reasoning mind, and then upholding those principles and actions as a matter of course in your life. So it would be being consistently rational, being consistently on the premise of, yeah, if I want values, I have to produce them or trade for them, being honest and so forth. So integrity for Rand is the development of an adherence to rational principles. Another virtue is independence. Independence is the virtue of using your own mind to make your own judgments about what's true and false, right and wrong, good and bad. You don't just go with the flow. You don't just go just because the crowd says something's true, or your parents or preachers or teachers say something is true doesn't make it true. Only individuals have reasoning minds, and all of us do. And the only way any of us can figure out what's true is by activating our mind and saying, what do I think? What's the evidence, right? Let's see, I'm going to go through the other two relatively quickly because I think we've spoken about this. There's justice and pride. I'll hit on these momentarily. And then Natalie, I'm going to go a little bit over today again. Is that okay? Or
Yes,
Natalie?
totally.
Thank you.
That's fine.
Because I do want to have a Q&A.
Sure.
So justice is the principle. Well, first of all, there's a principle here, right? People have free will. They can act rationally or irrationally, and they've got different skills and abilities, and we know that. So justice is the principle that recognizes this fact and then says, because that's true, you have to judge people rationally. You have to judge them according to the available and relevant facts, and then you've got to treat them accordingly, right? If you don't, what happens in life? So if I know that somebody is dishonest, and I go, well, I'm going to go into business with him anyway. That is not a good choice. That is not acting justly, and it's going to be very bad for you, because if you go into business with somebody who's dishonest, that's going to run into big problems for you, right? If you treat your lover unjustly, if you're mean to your lover inappropriately or whatever, that's not going to work well for you. Justice is an essential action. It's an essential principled action in human life. If we want good romantic relationships, good friendships, good work relationships, good buddies to go rock climbing with. If you go rock climbing with somebody who you can't trust, and he's the guy belaying you, like holding the rope, and you fall, you're dead, right? You don't want to judge people incorrectly. And by the way, justice does not only apply to moral judgment, it applies to all kinds of judgment. So right now, for instance, my company, Objective Standard Institute, is looking to hire some marketing people, and we've got applications coming in, and we're reading through these, and we have to be very careful to judge these applicants carefully and rationally. Do they have the actual skills that we need? Do they have the kind of attitude that we need for them to work with our team? Are they real go-getters? Do they have the kind of fervor about these succeeding in this that the rest of our team does? If they don't, and I were to misjudge them on that, then that would be bad for me and for my company and my team. So justice applies not only to moral judgment, it definitely applies there, but it applies also to just, look, you got to take seriously the fact that people have certain characteristics. And if you're going to deal with them, you got to know what those characteristics of this particular individual are. And you can think about this at the political level. If you have poor judgment about politicians, you might end up with politicians like Adolf Hitler, and who was actually elected by the German people, or not quite, not anywhere near as bad, but in the United States, we've had some really rotten politicians of late, particularly the presidents. I mean, Donald Trump was, he did a few good things in office, but he was essentially an embarrassment and just a horrible person, and did not do well for this country, in my view. This is my view, by the way. I just tell you that right now. I don't speak for Ayn Rand on that. I don't speak for anybody else. And now we have Joe Biden, who is a statist. He basically wants to turn America into a socialist country, as does the rest of his team. This is not good. Americans did not choose well. They did not judge well on these in these elections. Now, it came down to the final elections, and we only had what choices we had. But the whole work up to this, the primaries and all of that, we made very poor choices, and now we are suffering from using poor judgment and judging people poorly. All right, the last virtue in Rand's set of 7 is pride, and pride. You might know that Aristotle called pride the crown of the virtues. And I love that term, and Rand did too. And she called pride the sum of the virtues, and she described it as moral ambitiousness. And I love that phrase. It's moral ambitiousness. Now, moral in this context, because we're talking about Rand, we're not talking about Mother Teresa, we're not talking about altruism. This does not mean ambitiousness about giving up your values. It means the opposite. It means ambitiousness about pursuing your values, being rational, being honest, being just, upholding all of these virtues. That's why it's the sum of the virtues. It's moral ambitiousness about that, about living a beautiful life and engaging with good people and establishing win-win relationships. That's what pride in Rand's view is all about. Yes, Natalie.
We actually have a question from our audience, and I'm going to pack it a bit
perfect
into something. Does Ayn Rand consider liberty a virtue? And if she doesn't, is there a reason? And secondly, actually, what is the Ayn Rand's definition of liberty if it's not a virtue from that point of view?
Yeah, good question, because it allows me to make a contrast here that's super important. So liberty is not a virtue because it's not an action, right? You don't liberty. That's not a thing. It's not an action you can take. Liberty is a condition. It's a political condition. And tomorrow we're going to spend the whole day talking about it. So I'm not going to say a lot on this today. Rand regards liberty as absolutely essential to human life. We can't live if we can't act on our means of living, our judgment. And liberty is precisely the freedom to act on your judgment. It's the ability to act on your judgment uncoerced by other people or governments. So it's absolutely essential, but it's not a virtue. It's just a different category. It's a social condition that's essential to human life. So great question, but we're going to talk about this so much tomorrow that I don't want to get thrown off the track today. Was there another question in there?
Not in there, but something related to virtues, if you don't mind, but we can still go a bit.
Sure.
So if somebody comes from a background or has this, like in philosophy, we talk about moral luck. Sometimes some people born into a civil war in the middle of Syria, or they might be born with disabilities, and they feel like the life has been just unjust to them. So if they feel that they're treated unjustly just by the life itself, how could you pitch the question was, how could you pitch your idea to act virtuously and through life serving virtues if you think that the balance is off already for you?
Great question. Yeah, so it is absolutely true that some people are born into horrific contexts, right? Whether Syria or, I mean, think about the people in North Korea. To imagine being born there. So the less that you are free to act on your judgment, your reasoning mind, and to act in virtuous ways, the less you can do so. If I'm strapped to a tree or locked in a cage or put in a concentration camp, I can't do that at all. So it's just a matter of fact that I can't do the things that I'm advocating here. This is why liberty is so important. It's important that people not be forced. We need liberty. We need it so badly. And we'll talk a lot about this tomorrow. But whatever degree a person can use his mind and act on his best judgment and uphold these virtues, that's precisely the degree to which he should. If you're in a horrible place, if you're in Syria and you're in a horrible context, or if you're in North Korea, what should you do? Try to get the hell out of there and try to get your friends and family to come with you. Leave, right? The virtue there would be rationality, right? This is horrible to be here. Let's leave. Let's go someplace that's freer. And so this is one of the reasons that I'm for immigration. Basically, I think there should be border checks for who's coming into a country. But for people who want to flee horrible countries, let them in, as far as I'm concerned, as long as we don't have any evidence that they're coming here to try to harm us. If they're just good people trying to live their lives, I mean, let them all in. That's one of the reasons I'm all for immigration. So yeah, there are contexts that are really horrible. We need to fight against those contexts, which is tomorrow's session. And to whatever extent anyone around the world is able to use his mind, be honest, don't fake reality, judge people correctly, judge your politicians correctly. If you've got tyrants lording it over you, judge them correctly. They are evil. And if they're using force to eliminate lives, they deserve to die. You should kill them if you can. That's an act of justice in those cases. So this stuff gets really dire when the circumstances are really dire. But the right thing to do under a tyranny is to overthrow that tyranny by force, if necessary. And so, yeah, what I'm talking about here are virtues that hopefully people are free to take, to enact. You're hopefully free to act this way. And we need to make it so everyone is free to act this way. That's how the world should be. To the extent that we're not, we have a lot of work to do. And Students for Liberty is all about doing that work. So that's good. Okay. So yeah, last virtue there is pride. And this just means taking your life and your values seriously. Be a rational person. Engage with people who embrace these same kinds of virtues and do wonderful things together and live a great life. That's the whole point. Now, I want to say a quick few words about the immense value of rational people. By rational people, I mean precisely the kinds of people who uphold the virtues we were just talking about, people who are productive and honest and just and independent thinkers and all of that. Why do we want to be around those people? The question almost answers itself, right? At this point is just to talk about the immense value of rational people. Cooperation, specialization, trade, recreation, romantic love, friendship, good governance, so that we're not lorded, so that tyranny doesn't exist. All of these things come from what? Rational people engaging in rational ways. And by rational here, I don't just mean using reason to get whatever you want. I mean using reason to recognize the full context of the requirements of human life and then acting accordingly within that context. So it is true that a bank robber can use his reasoning mind to make a plot to rob a bank. And it's true that a dictator can use his reasoning mind to make a plot to murder hundreds of millions of people. That doesn't make him rational. It means that he's using his rational faculty out of focus and out of context and ignoring huge swaths of facts about reality that he should not be ignoring. That is not rational, it's irrational. So don't confuse the mere pocket, segregated or compartmentalized use of reason as being rational. That is not the same thing. Rand's conception of rationality means the full context of it's full context thinking, if you will. So that's what the virtues are all about. The value of rational people is precisely the value of people who uphold these virtues. These are the people that we can live beautiful lives in conjunction with, and that we should aim to have in our lives. This leads me to the last point for the day, and that is the traitor principle, which is a beautiful principle that Ayn Rand identifies. And the traitor principle is just basically the idea that all human relationships should be based on the exchange of value for value, right? And this is true not only in material or monetary terms. It's true also in spiritual terms, and we can see that very quickly. This is obviously the case in trade. You make hamburgers. I'm hungry for a hamburger. I pay you for a hamburger. There's a trade, win-win. Everybody on the call gets that stuff. So I'm not going to focus on that as much as I will on the spiritual aspect here. Love, friendship, these kinds of relationships are based on trade. If I were to go to my wife and say, look, I don't get anything out of our relationship at all. There's nothing in this for me. I just do everything for you. There's nothing in this for me. She would be appalled. Well, first of all, she'd laugh because she'd know that I must be joking. But if she took it seriously, she'd be appalled, right? And so would your lover or girlfriend or boyfriend, right? That's just not why. Because we all know on some level that a romantic relationship is a trade. You get something out of it, or your lover gets something out of it. You both get something out of it. That's what makes it awesome. That's why sexual ecstasy is wonderful. You're like, I love this person, and we're at the peak of this wonderful thing we're doing, and that's just one of the best times in life, right? And it's a trade. So Rand's principle, the traitor principle here, is not only about material values. It is emphatically also about spiritual values. Gratitude, when somebody does something really, really good for you or important or helpful to you, and he's done that, maybe he's not even expecting something back from you. He's just doing it because he thinks you're a great person and he wants to help you out in some way. Now, what's the trade there before you even react to that? Well, why is he doing that? You've already given him a value. You've already given him a value. The value of your being, the value of your example, or whatever it is that he felt a good reason to give you something so generously, right? And so you get something if somebody gives you a really nice birthday present, right? Or if somebody just gives you somebody invites you on a vacation and pays the whole thing, right? So what's happening there? He's not asking you for something else. The friendship or the values you've already delivered to that person is a form of payment. It's a spiritual payment, and he's just giving you something that he thinks is helping to be a part of that trade, if you will. And then the other thing there is the gratitude that you might offer to somebody who does that for you, which is another thing. You might write him a really nice thank you note and say, hey, I can't believe you took me on this vacation and covered all the expenses. You know, I'm in school and I couldn't have afforded that. And it's really lovely that you did that. That gratitude is also a trade. And all of these kinds of things. And, you know, so don't artificially constrict what it means to trade with human beings. Think about a human being as the very complex creatures that we are, with reason and emotion and purpose and all of these things. And when you're trading with each other, you're just, and you're not doing a balance sheet either. It's not like, well, I took you on a vacation and now you owe me this. No, human trades don't happen that way. Human trades happen just sort of in a spiritual, in a spiritual continuum where you're like, yeah, I love hanging out with this person. I do good things for him because I get a lot of him out of the relationship. And then he does the same thing. So the principle of trade is the fundamental principle, according to Rand, by which all human relationships should operate, both material and spiritual relationships. And that's the final point I wanted to make today. Before we start the Q&A, I'll just give you a heads up that tomorrow, we've talked a lot about the value of rational people today and how much we can do together. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about a particular danger that people can be to us. And that is when they try to use force against us, or when they do use force against us. And that's a huge problem. And that's the problem we're going to talk about addressing tomorrow. So let's take Q&A for, let's do at least, I'd like to do 15 minutes if we can do that, Nasli.
Sure, we'll see. So we have one question. That's not exact. So I actually have a question about the trade-off principle. We
Sure.
can do that, or we have another question about from Logos Nomos. So they say that, what is the foundation of reason? What is the standard to declare something reasonable? And if it's your own reasoning, then isn't it subjective also?
So yeah, let's start with that question. What is the foundation of reason? And if it's just the use of your own mind, then isn't that subjective? Because the premise here is that you're a subject and you're using your mind. And so isn't that just subjective? And Rand would say, no, that it is not subjective. Subjective doesn't mean the use of your mind. Subjective means using your mind only in an internal sense and not being cognizant of the external facts of reality. Subjectivity is just the internal cognition with no recourse to the facts as you can perceive them. And Rand regarded being subjective as basically just whim worship. You're just going by whatever you happen to believe or think or want. Whereas objectivity is, yes, you're using your mind. So the subject is using his or her mind, but it's not just internal machinations. It's internal focus on external reality. It's a focus on a fact. So let's get some examples on the table. If I'm walking down the street and I see a speeding bus coming down the intersection, and I just go, well, in my mind, buses aren't real, and I just step out in front of that speeding bus, what happens? Is it a subjective thing that I die, or is it an objective fact that I die? It's an objective fact that I die, and we all know that, right? Some philosophy professors will go, well, no, you don't know if you really died, but we're not going to get into that silliness because it's not worth it. I don't waste time on things like that. You know that if you step in front of a speeding truck, you will die. Just like if you know if you run off a 1,000-foot cliff without a parachute, you will die, right? So we don't do those things because we know that objectively it would be a disaster. So it's not true that just the use of your mind renders any decision you make on the basis of that use subjective. The question is, are you using your mind in such a way that's being genuinely cognizant of the facts as you perceive reality? There's a reality out there. We know it. We know it. Why? Because we live in it and function in it. We're using it right now to speak to each other across the globe. And we know that there are satellites that are helping all of this to happen. And none of this is subjective. It's a fact. So No, it's not. Just because you're using your mind doesn't make it subjective. What makes it subjective is if you're using your mind in disregard of what you know at the perceptual level to be true, and we'll talk more about this toward the end of the course, and also in disregard of what you know to be true just more broadly. You know a lot, and you know it on the basis of observation and integration and logic, and don't let anyone talk you out of the fact that you do possess that knowledge. If someone demonstrates that one of the ideas that you're holding in your mind is false by showing you evidence that contradicts that idea, well, then you should say, thank you for helping me to correct this problem. And now I have, now I know that I was wrong about something and I know what's right. There's nothing wrong with erring and then being corrected, and that happens all the time. But to suggest that we don't have objective knowledge at all is just belied by everything. If you just look around, where did all this stuff come from if nobody knows anything, right? So that's the way I would handle that. And Rand says, no, objectivity is the integration of the in here, the use of the mind, with the out there, the facts of reality that we perceive. And it's the union of those things to produce knowledge, such as if you step in front of a speeding truck, you'll die, or at a much higher level, if you elect tyrannical people to lord it over your country, you will live a miserable life and probably die young and in a brutal context. Like, don't do those things. We know that liberty is essential to human life. We know this historically, we know it economically, and we know it philosophically today, or at least if you understand Rand's ideas, you'll know it philosophically. And so it would be crazy to say, well, that's just a subjective opinion of yours. It is not a subjective opinion. Or Rand would say that's ridiculous to call that a subjective opinion. It's a fact about the kind of animal that we are, that we need freedom to live and thrive. So again, there's a whole range of objectivity there that you can see, from the speeding truck to the need of liberty.
Great. So my question is actually a bit about the trader principle. So we talk about how we trade with people, but not only on the commercial trade type of thing. Like every time we have a relationship, we have interaction, that is actually traded in itself. I wanted to ask you about, how is it relevant to Kant's ideal of not using means to an end? So for instance, you mentioned, like, you go to a shop, you go buy an apple, you pay for it. And so you use that person as a means, but not to an end, for an end too. So how does that trader principle, or how does Ayn Rand think about that part of the trader principle?
Yeah, so Kant's language is always so confusing, and I think it's intentionally that way. So it's better. Let's put this in, rather than using Kant's language and make this confusing. Let's just talk about the means end relationship of human beings with each other. Okay. Kant would say that you should not use people as means, but treat them only as ends, right? So you're not supposed to use them as means to end. But that's crazy if you think about it in a romantic relationship. I'm using the relationship I have with my wife. She is both an end and a means for me. She's a means to all sorts of pleasure and wonder and joy. And she's an end in that I do things for her all the time because I love her. Because so there's the means end relationship on an objectivist conception is positive in both directions. Now, what you should not do is abuse people, treat them in a way that you're using them and getting something from them, but they're getting absolutely nothing out of you. And this is what a robber does when he robs your home, right? He breaks into your home and he steals your jewelry. Now he has your jewelry and you have nothing. You don't have your jewelry. So why is this wrong? Well, he's treating you as a means to his getting wealth, and he's not respecting your individuality, your autonomy, your rights, your needs in your own life to live as a human being. And so Rand says that's wrong. You should not treat people that way, because each person is an end in himself. She uses this phrase a lot. Each individual is an end in himself, not a means to the ends of others. Now, That's true, but she also would say that that you are a means to joy in relationships with other people, right? She would not say that her husband Frank was not someone who gave her great joy. So he was a means of sorts to bring her great joy. So there's a means end relationship there that I think is the best way to think about relationships like that. What she really means, Rand, when she says people are not a means to the ends of others, they're ends in themselves, not a means to the ends of others, is that people should not be sacrificed. That's what she means. It's wrong to sacrifice other people for your ends, and it's wrong for them to expect you to sacrifice for their ends. This goes back to the opening point I made today, which is that objectivism is a philosophy of life. It's a philosophy of value pursuits. And that the negative statement of that same principle is that it's a philosophy that says, do not sacrifice yourself to others, nor others to yourself. Sacrifice is wrong. It's the giving up of values, the destruction of values. We don't need to do that, and we shouldn't. What we should do is produce values, trade them with each other, whether spiritual or material. And so when you get something out of a friendship with someone, that's good. And when he gets something out of that friendship with you, that's good. And when people want to have things without reciprocation like that, that's bad. And we should stay away from those people. Those are not people that we want to deal with. They're not rational. They're not operating on the trader principle. And they're not really, they're not living as human beings. They're trying to live at a subhuman level. They're trying to live as a being that doesn't have the needs that we in fact have. And I think that's a really good way to think about it. When people do that, people who act irrationally are trying to live on a subhuman level. They're still human beings because they still have the capacity to think, but they're not thinking. And they've, by choice, reduced themselves to almost an animalistic type of life. And my advice to them is stop doing that. Come back up to the human level and live with the rest of us at the human level. Be a thinker, be a trader, be a lover of life. You know, engage your mind and live in this one wonderful life that we have. So that's how I answer it, and I think that's all consistent with the way that Rand thinks about these things.
And I think that was a great answer. Our last question, because we went over time quite a bit, but it's very simple. So one of our viewers asked that, where does empathy stand within this life-serving virtues? Is it part of it? Is it some subsection of any of those things?
Yeah, empathy is one of the most fascinating human characteristics to me. It's interesting. I have a daughter who's extremely empathetic. She can really, feel other people's joy or other people's pain or whatever. And some people don't have that. I have a fair amount of empathy. I think I'm a pretty empathetic person. But I know people who are more empathetic than I am. And I know other people who basically are almost blank. Like they cannot tell what what the state of consciousness or emotional state of other people is. And I don't know what explains that. There's something very interesting there about psychology, and psychology is a very complex field that I think is still in its infancy. So I don't know what the best writing is on that, but I'd like to read something about it. But here's what I will say about empathy. It can be problematic if you're extremely empathetic and you don't learn how to deal with that so that you don't wind up committing sacrifices. If you're really empathetic and you have, let's say you've got several friends and they're all going through difficulties in life, and you can really sort of feel their difficulties and pain at times. And that feeling makes you feel bad, right? You feel negative about that. And so you start doing a lot to help them. Well, there's nothing wrong with helping your friends. Don't get me wrong here. But if you do that so much that you do it to the exclusion of the purposes and goals that you had set for yourself to make your life great, that's going to be a sacrifice of your own life for other people. So you have to be careful if you're a highly empathetic person, because you could be an egoist, not an altruist. So altruism is the moral code that says you should sacrifice for other people. Empathy is not the same thing, but it can have the same effect, because it can lead you to sacrifice just because you feel like, oh, but these are my friends and I need to do this thing for them because I love them so much. And you just want to be careful not to, just be careful if you're empathetic to keep an eye on what you're doing and whether you're going too far in helping other people and that's becoming an expense of that's to the detriment of your own life and your own goals. So I'm glad that this came up because this brings to mind this a genuine psychological issue. I actually think empathy is a good thing. I think it's good to be able to identify with other people. It helps you in business dealings, it helps you in friendships, it helps you in all sorts of ways. But if you let that empathy drive you into to effectively sacrificing for others when you don't really intend to do that, it's problematic. So be aware of it if you're super empathetic. I don't think empathy is a virtue in the sense that you should be empathetic, because I think that would be a bad thing to say to people who aren't empathetic. They just don't. I think it's a psychological thing, and I wouldn't want to say, well, you should be empathetic, and then the people who aren't would feel like, well, but I'm not, and right, because it's a psychological thing. So I don't think it's a virtue per se. I think it's a characteristic that can be very helpful. And maybe you can train yourself to be more empathetic. Again, that would be a psychological question, and I'm not a psychologist, so I don't know. But I suspect that that's true. I suspect that if you're not an empathetic person, you can probably work with a psychologist to figure out what are the cues that I can see in people's countenance, their faces, their body language, so that I can start to understand where people are coming from and what their context is. And likewise, if you're so empathetic that it's causing you problems in life, you could probably work with a good therapist to figure out how to, mitigate that to some extent so that it doesn't cause you problems. And I don't know what the means of doing that would be, but that's a fascinating question, and that's probably about all I can say on it there.
And I think it's also a good way to end this this webinar today. It's something to think about for the rest of their days for our viewers. And thank you very much, Craig, for joining us today as well. Tomorrow, we're going to continue with our third webinar, and it's going to be about the more important things that we usually think about as libertarians, individual rights, government, and the fundamental philosophy. So please tune in, please continue following us. We're going to have, I assume, very bold questions tomorrow. So
I hope so. Yeah. So let me, if I may, can I say just a few quick words about tomorrow?
Sure, of course.
All right. So yeah, tomorrow we're going to be talking about individual rights and government, what individual rights are, where they come from, if they exist, and then about government. Do we need a government? If so, why? I know a lot of people on the call probably don't think that we should have government, and we'll talk about Rand's views on that. I think it'll be really helpful. So I'm excited about that. Please have your questions ready. You can send them in advance if you'd like, and we'll address that stuff tomorrow. I'd also just like to say that if you're interested in these ideas, and after the second day, you probably know whether you are or you're not, and some people might not be, but if you are, I urge you to visit Objective Standard Institute, where we teach courses on these ideas and run conferences on these ideas and have all sorts of, we have several podcasts and the like. And you can also visit the Objective Standard, which is a journal. These are two different pages. Objective Standard Institute is one thing, and Objective Standard Journal is another. And there we have all sorts of articles. We've been doing that for 15 years. So we have an archive of thousands of articles on good living, liberty, the foundations of all these things. So check those things out and engage with us there if you want. We've got some great programs, and I think you'll find that really helpful.
Great. So until today, please subscribe to our channel and give us some thumbs up, and stay libertarian, as we usually say, and have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you, Nesla. Thanks all. Bye-bye.
Bye.